Welcome everybody to our special Day of Giving webinar. We are really excited to have you all here today to join us to learn from Dr. Dan Potter about building a better monarch butterfly garden. Before we jump into that, I have a couple of announcements and reminders, and then Mandy Queen, who is Director of Philanthropy, is going to just say a few words about Day of Giving. But for my reminders, I just want to ask everybody to please keep your microphone on mute. If you have questions as we're going along, you're welcome to drop them into chat, but we will save all questions until the end of the webinar. And Dan has said he is welcome to stay and answer questions as long as we want to ask them. So we look forward to that. Also, I wanted to mention today's webinar is sponsored by the Extension Master Gardener Endowment. So when you donate to the endowment, the interest income that is generated by that makes special events like today possible. And we appreciate everyone who has given support to the endowment. And with that, I'll ask Mandy Queen to share with us a little bit about Day of Giving.
Thank you, Charlotte. Happy Day of Giving. That was the perfect segue to share with this group how gifts to Extension Master Gardeners make an impact and help all of us and help Extension Master Gardeners carry out the mission all across North Carolina. I'm joining you all from the Plant Sciences building on Centennial campus at NC State. So from Raleigh this morning, where we're all gathered in the spirit of Day of Giving and hoping to raise a lot of funds for several different causes across the state, in the College of Ag and Life Sciences, and Extension especially. So thank you for what you do as Extension Master Gardeners and the role you play in the mission of Extension. And we have a special challenge on Day of Giving just for Extension Master Gardeners. A donor has provided a $10,000 match or challenge. So if we raise half of that, $5,000, today we'll unlock a $10,000 unrestricted gift for Extension Master Gardeners. So there's a QR code on the slide that's showing now. You can use that. And I have been really enjoying following along in the chat and seeing everybody and where they're joining us from. And so I'm going to drop a link in the chat right now, and you can make a gift to directly to Extension Master Gardeners and help us reach our challenge before midnight tonight using that link directly. But thank you for having me, Charlotte. I'm excited to hear more about butterfly gardens.
All right. Thank you, Mandy. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Potter, who is Professor Emeritus of Entomology at the University of Kentucky. For 44 years, Dan's research has shaped sustainable pest management and pollinator conservation in urban landscapes. He is a nationally recognized leader in his field, an award-winning educator, and a sought-after keynote speaker at scientific and industry conferences worldwide. His contributions have been honored by the Entomological Society of America, the U.S. Golf Association, and the American Nursery and Landscape Association. We're delighted to have you with us today, Dan, and we're eager to learn about your research and how we can build a better monarch butterfly garden. So with that, I'm going to stop my share so I can turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. We're going to all cross our fingers and hope this works. Let's give it a go.
It's looking positive.
Looking good. Yeah, I'm speaking to you from sunny Lexington, Kentucky in my home today, and I want to thank everybody for attending, and especially Charlotte for inviting me. It's really an honor to give this presentation. And of course, our topic is building a better monarch butterfly garden. Now, let's see if I can get this to advance. Good. Are you all seeing my slides okay?
Yes, we see them.
Okay, good. Okay, so before I begin, I want to say that although I was the mentor for Dr. Adam Baker and we designed the experiments I'll be talking about together, Adam was my last PhD student, and he did most of the crawling around on his hands and knees, counting the eggs and larvae, getting the ticks and sugar bites, and so on. I want to give a shout out to Adam for all of his contributions to the research that I'll be talking about during the second portion of my talk. Couldn't have done it without him. So let's see if I can advance these slides. Not happening. Okay, good. Keep my fingers crossed here. So I like to begin this talk by asking my audience, what good is a monarch? You can't eat it. Is it really a great pollinator? What do you think? Um, well, the answer really is that it pollinates a few things here and there. It will pollinate and carry pollen on its mouth parts and legs, but it's certainly not a great pollinator compared to something like a honeybee, which works many, many more flowers than a monarch does. Is it particularly beautiful? Well, yeah, I mean, they're really attractive butterflies for sure. But I would argue that monarchs are not necessarily any more attractive than a tiger swallowtail or a luna moth on the lower right, or a zebra swallowtail, one of my favorites. And yet we don't have festivals, celebrating tiger swallowtails or luna moths, at least not very often. So there's something different about monarchs that is really special. Is it good food for songbirds? You might or might not know that monarchs are not good food for songbirds. In fact, they're very poor food for songbirds, and they will cause them to have a violent reaction if they try to eat one. So why do we care? Why do we care about monarchs? I think perhaps those of you who are master gardeners would agree with me that we care about monarchs for the same reason we care about bald eagles and polar bears and whales. None of us is going to ever eat a bald eagle. We're probably not going to see a live polar bear unless we have a lot of money to go on a trip to the Arctic. And we don't heat our homes with whale oil anymore, or have whalebone corsets and things. But we care about these animals because they are conservation icons that tell us something about the health of our environment. The monarch is a beloved native North American butterfly and has certainly become a conservation icon, a symbol of a healthy environment. And there are millions of people who are involved in gardening for monarch butterflies and are concerned about them. Here's a picture of one of my heroines, Dr. Jane Goodall, and I'm sure you all recognize her. And she's very, very often photographed wearing her iconic monarch butterfly scarf. And I think she's just wearing that as a symbol of the importance of the natural environment and conservation. Monarchs inspire an interest in nature. They are the state insect of 7 states. They're celebrated in festivals all around North America. They're often the first insect that our children study in their elementary school classrooms. My wife was a first grade teacher and she reared monarchs in her classroom to learn about life cycles and metamorphosis. The very hungry caterpillar was probably not a monarch caterpillar, but you get the idea. This is a photograph of a place that I'm sure many of you have been, the North Carolina Arboretum, one of my favorite places to visit. And they have this wonderful Lego monarch sculpture at the garden and also a beautiful Lego milkweed plant, amazing, and also interpretive signage. And although we don't have a Lego monarch at our Arboretum, we do have interpretive signage. And so monarchs are often used in this way to inform the public about conservation and nature. In the Mexican culture, monarchs' arrival each year symbolizes the souls of deceased loved ones who are returning to visit on the Day of the Dead. And monarchs symbolize resilience and transformation and hope. So they have a lot of spiritual value as well, much the way cicadas do in some of the Asian countries. Monarchs are good for business. On the left is a garden center in Lexington, Kentucky with their pollinator day, and you see the monarch poster hanging there in the awning. And they sell a lot of milkweed plants and nectar plants. You notice on the upper right, Subaru loves monarchs. Now, I don't know what the connection is between Subaru and monarchs, but they obviously think it's valuable for their advertising. And even BASF, their logo is We Create Chemistry. They're located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, and they make agricultural chemicals. So the connection with monarchs isn't necessarily that clear, but I will say that even BASF does sponsor a number of programs to encourage farmers to set aside some of their unused land for milkweed. You notice on the lower left that they fund pollinator research, and they in fact did fund some of my research on monarch butterflies. So hats off to them. They want to be on the right side of this issue, and it's obviously good public relations. Sales of milkweed transplants and seeds are booming, and if you talk to the garden centers and such, they can barely keep the monarch transplants on the shelves, and very, very good for business to sell milkweeds and nectar plants. So what makes the monarch so special? Again, we don't celebrate tiger swallowtails and zebra swallowtails and many other pretty butterflies. I would suggest that it's really the Great Migration. Now, my wife and I, as a 45th anniversary bucket list trip, actually went to East Africa a year ago, and we saw the amazing Great Migration with the wildebeests and the zebras, but it's not cheap and it's a long way away. But we can watch one of the world's great migrations, perhaps the world's greatest insect migration, right in our own backyards. Using air currents and thermals, some of our monarch butterflies will fly more than 3,000 miles to reach their overwintering home in the central highlands of Mexico. And it has captured the imagination of people all over North America to observe this amazing phenomenon. We actually have two populations of monarchs in North America. The eastern population, which we're all familiar with, is a bigger population. And then a second western population west of the Rocky Mountains, where those butterflies don't overwinter in Mexico so much. They overwinter in sites along the Pacific coast. But we're going to talk mainly about the eastern population, the one that we see in Kentucky and in North Carolina. Now, a lot of people might not realize that where the monarchs go in the cold months was not always known. I mean, it was certainly known to the indigenous people of central Mexico, but as far as folks in our neck of the woods, it was a real mystery where the monarchs went until 1976, when a scientist hiked up into the fir forests of mountain region of central Mexico and quote unquote discovered where the monarchs go. And it was revealed to the world in this issue of National Geographic in 1976. I'd already graduated from college by then, so it was something that's fairly recently disclosed. Eastern monarchs, as I'm sure you know, overwinter in the fir forests in the highlands of central Mexico, and they go there by the millions. And it's now an area that's prospering from a lot of ecotourism from the United States for folks that want to go down there and see this amazing phenomenon and photograph it. After living off their fat reserves in the wintertime down there in the central highlands of Mexico, the butterflies will become active, they'll mate, and they'll begin their journey north, again, by the millions. The first generation monarchs in the eastern US are the offspring of the butterflies that overwintered in Mexico, the children. And they'll make it up to about Texas, and they'll reproduce there and breed. And then there'll be another generation that makes itself farther north. So the ones we see in North Carolina or Kentucky might be the grandchildren or even the great-grandchildren of the butterflies that overwintered in Mexico. And through 3 or 4 successive generations, the population works its way up to the northern United States and on into Canada. And then when the days begin to get shorter and the temperatures begin to drop a little bit, the eastern monarchs somehow get a signal that it's time to fly south. And those butterflies, even from the northern Great Plains in southern Canada, will fly all the way back to Mexico, often riding thermals and storm fronts and such, along a number of flyways that converge in central Texas and then find their way down to their overwintering grounds. The butterflies that arrive at the overwintering sites in Mexico have never been there before. After all, they're the great-great or great-great-great-grandchildren of the ones that overwintered before, yet they know exactly where to go. And how they do that is a mystery. Scientists believe that they use the sun's position and the Earth's magnetic field to navigate, but of course there's also instinct involved to know which particular forest to navigate to. It's an amazing thing that still needs to be studied to be fully worked out. Now, monarchs, as I'm sure you know, are host plant specialists. Another thing that makes them special. Their caterpillars rely on milkweeds, the genus Asclepias, and a few closely related genera like the honeyvine milkweed in order to grow and develop. If they don't have milkweeds, the caterpillars can't survive. And they're one of a very small number of insects that are able to eat milkweeds. Milkweed is a toxic plant for most herbivores, rabbits, for most insects, because it contains latex canals, not the veins themselves, but a series of canals that ramify along the veins. And these canals are imbibed with or pressurized with a blend or a brew, if you will, of toxic cardenolides in a quick setting glue. There's a plant that we grow at Christmas time in our homes that has a very similar type of chemical defense. It's, of course, poinsettia. And if you ever prick a poinsettia leaf or break it, you'll see similar latex type sap that oozes from the poinsettia. Now, if a non-adapted caterpillar, say this little tiny armyworm caterpillar, were to bite the milkweed, under pressure, it gets a big mouthful of what's essentially poisonous Elmer's glue that will gum up its mouth parts and intoxicate it, and it will come to a bad end. Now, cardenolides, the chemicals in milkweed, are potent plant chemical defenses against herbivores. And there are other plants that contain cardenolides as well. One of the coolest ones is the poison arrow plant of the Kalahari Desert. And you can see the Bushmen here who use a chemical called huabane as a poison arrow to tip their poison arrows. And it has an effect that can bring down large game. Digitalis is another cardenolide from foxglove, and you may know that digitalis is used as a heart remedy. It slows the heart, and we use it as a human pharmacologic agent. And then milkweed is another one that contains these plant defensive chemicals. Monarchs are able to cope with the cardenolides in milkweed in a variety of ways. I won't have time to go into all of them, but when a baby monarch hatches, like the one you see in the upper left, the first thing it will do is to go around in a circle and snip the veins. And then the toxic latex sap will ooze out from those cuts, and the little caterpillar can feed inside in that little safe island of tissue where it's reducing its dose of these chemicals. Larger monarch caterpillars will cut the veins, and you can see two ways of doing this. One is cut the petiole, and one has severed the midvein of a leaf, and then they will feed distal or beyond the cut where the chemicals are much less concentrated. They do store up some of the chemicals, though, in their own defense. And if a caterpillar sort of senses that its chemical defenses are getting a little low, it may turn around and actually drink some more of that sap to kind of up its own defenses. There are other insects that feed on milkweed, and if you've grown milkweed, you're no doubt familiar with them. We have milkweed bugs like the ones on the left. We have milkweed beetles like the longhorn milkweed beetle or the other one below. And we have these pesky milkweed or oleander aphids that are bright fluorescent orange. All of these insects sequester or store up the chemicals from the milkweed plant, and then they use them as a chemical shield against predators like ladybird beetles and praying mantises and such. Does it really work? Absolutely. One of my colleagues, Stephen Malcolm, did a study some years ago that I found fascinating. He reared web-making spiders on window frames, and then he took some of these oleander aphids, the milkweed aphids, and he fed those to the spiders to see how it would affect their ability to build their webs. And these were naive spiders that didn't know any better. On the left, you can see the normal web with its beautiful symmetry. In the middle, you see a web that was made by a spider just 2 days after it ate less than a single aphid. And it's almost as if the spider were on cocaine or heroin or some other drug. It's not able to spin a proper web. It's leaving out some of the lines. And he actually showed in the experiment these webs are not very effective at catching prey. And even 6 days later, the spider was still so sufficiently intoxicated that it couldn't really spin a proper web. So these aphids are very toxic to non-adapted predators. And the same would be true of a monarch caterpillar. These are famous photos from Lincoln Brower, one of the pioneers of monarch research. He reared naive blue jays in the lab. He kept them as pets. And then he would offer a naive blue jay a monarch. It would immediately seize it and start to eat it. And then a few minutes later, yuck. And it would violently vomit. It would look very upset for a while, refuse to eat. And then the next time it was offered a monarch butterfly, they would say, no way, no way. So it's an interesting thing that we have many butterflies, at least these three and perhaps more as well, that occur in the eastern US that have all converged on a similar coloration. Viceroy on the left, the queen in the middle, which is found in Florida, and farther south, and the monarch. And I would ask you, and you probably know, why are they all so similar looking? We call this phenomenon mimicry, where different animals may mimic the color of a toxic species, or may all in fact be toxic in their own right, but come to resemble one another. And that's the case with these three. They're all distasteful. So it turns out that if a bird were to experience one of them, it would learn that orange and black butterflies aren't very good, and it would avoid all of the ones that were similar enough it couldn't distinguish them on the wing. So they all gain mutual protection. This is a Kentucky license plate that one can buy. You can get one with a smallmouth bass or a butterfly. Do you know, is this a monarch or a viceroy? Give you a minute to think in your own mind. It's actually not a monarch, it's a viceroy. And you might see the line on the hind wing that transcribes the hind wing from left to right. The monarch butterfly lacks that wing, and the viceroy, that line, and the viceroy has it, which is one of the ways we can tell them apart. Viceroys are a little smaller as well. Notice that line is missing in these true monarchs, where it's there on the hind wing of the viceroy. Another thing that you might find interesting is, how do you tell the boys from the girls? The female monarch butterflies have thicker veins. You can see they're more prominent on the left, but it's easy to spot a male by those black spots on the hind wings. These are scent glands, sort of like I think they produce an aphrodisiac, sort of like, Old Spice aftershave, presumably. And those scent glands produce pheromones that are used in the courtship of the males and females. And the males also have thinner, less prominent veins. So if you see black spots, those are the scent patches of the male monarch butterflies. This is a scene from my garden in the backyard. My wife likes to grow herbs, and she asked me one day, yikes, are these monarch caterpillars eating my parsley and my celery? And she's not an entomologist or a master gardener. I think you know the answer. They're not monarchs if they're eating parsley and celery. They're actually the larvae of the black swallowtail butterfly, which also imbibe or sequester chemicals from the parsley and celery and are chemically defended in their own right, but they're not monarchs. Here's another picture from my own garden where we had a monarch caterpillar on the milkweed, and then right next to it was a different one. And can you tell which is which? The one on the left is the monarch, the one on the right is the black swallowtail. And the way we can tell very easily is that monarch caterpillars are striped black, white, and yellow, but they also have these odd tentacles on the head and on the tail end of the caterpillar that become more prominent as the caterpillar gets larger. And these are no doubt sensory, almost acting like feelers or antennae. The black swallowtail lacks those. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about what makes monarchs special. Their migration, their warning coloration, the fact that they only eat milkweeds. They're involved in mimicry with things like the viceroy on the lower left, and they are toxic to birds and other predators. We know that monarchs are declining, and no doubt you've read about this in the newspapers and magazines. How do we know they're declining? We know this because monarchs are censused every year. The populations are counted at the overwintering sites in Mexico. Citizen scientists and other scientists go to these sites and they actually measure the area that's occupied by the overwintering colonies in these monarch overwintering reserves. We also know that monarchs are declining because of citizen science monitoring. And some of you, I'm sure, have probably been involved in monarch tagging programs and these types of activities. This is an interesting aerial photo, again, taken by Lincoln Brower, of the monarch overwintering sites at one of their habitats in Mexico. And the orange that you see in the trees are the overwintering colonies of the monarchs. So one can now fly a drone over these types of sites or a small airplane, photograph them, and actually calculate the acreage of monarchs that make it back to Mexico each winter. And this is the primary way they census the population. Now, in the upper left of this image, you can see one of the problems. It's kind of a disturbing image. You can see the deforestation that's going on right next to the monarch habitat. And this is one of the threats to monarch populations where they overwinter. So they have graphed these populations beginning about the mid-1990s. Scientists believe that it's going to take about 6 hectares of monarch butterfly coverage down there to have a sustainable population. That's about 13 acres of monarchs, not really a lot. And you can see that since about 2010, that population has been well below that sustainable threshold for almost every year except one. And in fact, it's dipped quite low. It's the second lowest it's ever been in the last census of 23 to 24. So there's a lot of concern that a late freeze, a hurricane, a forest fire, all sorts of disturbances might be enough to kick the eastern population over the edge in the overwintering grounds, which would be a tragedy. Breaking news, December 2024, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposes that the monarch be listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. I don't know if this is going to happen under the current administration. I have my own thoughts about that. I won't go into that, but nonetheless, it is on the docket right now for consideration as a federally threatened species. Okay, why else are monarchs declining? I've already talked about loss of overwintering habitat through illegal logging and other types of disturbances there. Another major reason that's been identified by a lot of research is loss of breeding habitat, milkweed, and nectar plants in the breeding grounds of the United States. You can see here a picture of a gigantic soybean monoculture or another agricultural monoculture. These Roundup ready crops, corn, soybeans, and others, have been genetically engineered where you can spray the whole field with a herbicide and not hurt the crop. But when the farmers do spray the entire field, it kills off all the other plants that are there, the so-called weeds, including the milkweed. And so there's essentially nothing in between the rows or around the edge of the field growing there, whether it's dandelions or whether it's milkweed, it's gone. So most of big ag in America is growing these Roundup ready crops, and that's a tremendous loss of the natural breeding habitat of monarchs, especially in the Midwest. And then we've lost a lot of our habitat too to urbanization. We have subdivisions that look like this in Lexington, and you probably have them around where you are too. There are places just down the street from me which used to have lots of wild milkweed growing in them that now have moles and subdivisions on them. And we've lost an awful lot of milkweed habitat for this reason as well. Monarchs need 2 things for breeding and migration. They have to have milkweed for the caterpillars, and they have to have nectar for the butterflies. That's their Gatorade, their 5-hour energy. That's their sugar fix for getting around, for flying and finding more milkweed. So both things are required for the survival of the population. Scientists have determined that planting milkweed is the key to the North American Monarch Conservation Plan. This plan actually exists in agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It was worked out during the Obama administration. And scientists expect or estimate that it's going to be about 2 billion additional stems of milkweed that need to be added to the North American landscape to sustain the population. And they also realize that it needs to be all hands on deck. The contributions from all land use sectors are going to be needed to restore enough milkweed, not just farmscapes. The models say that farmscapes will not be enough alone. So it's going to take farm reserve lands, roadsides, industrial rights of way, and urban and suburban gardens. And we're going to be talking for most of the rest of this talk about the urban and suburban garden portion of this. You're probably familiar that there is one program called Monarch Way Stations. And this is a program that was started by Chip Taylor out in Kansas, where organizations can send away for a seed kit, or they can purchase the seeds on their own and then plant small gardens with milkweed and nectar plants and then certify their gardens on a registry. These are very popular at elementary schools, nature centers, nursing homes, even military bases have planted Monarch Way Stations. We have one near our local library. There are more than 40,000 of these registered, and no doubt many that aren't registered. And then there have been initiatives by the horticulture industry, which of course benefits them selling milkweeds and nectar plants. This was one called the Million Pollinator Garden Challenge. And they met this challenge with more than 1 million gardens registered in just 3 years. And I'm willing to bet that almost every one of these gardens has milkweed in it, and probably millions more that are not registered in this program. So with that as an introduction for why we care about monarchs and why they're in trouble, I want to spend the rest of my talk focusing on our research. And we were really among the first, perhaps the first, to really focus on small gardens as far as how to improve or optimize small gardens to support monarch butterfly conservation. There's been a lot of work on milkweeds out in farmscapes and things, but not so much in this area. And again, a shout out to Adam Baker, my last of 48 PhD students. We published all of our work in open access scientific journals, and these are free for anyone to download. There are actually others as well. If any of you are interested in reading the original research, you can simply drop me an email, and I'll be really happy to send you the papers on a return email. It'll only take me a second or two to do that. So if you'd like to read the original science, happy to share it. Okay, Monarch Way Station guidelines, pretty vague. If you go to their website, they say plant your garden in full sun, include 2 or more milkweed species, but they don't specify which ones, include some nectar sources, and they also say plant the plants close together. Okay, it's still pretty vague. The first question we asked was what garden characteristics promote use by monarchs? And we started with a survey of about nearly 24 master gardeners in Kentucky who had planted monarch butterfly habitat. Here's Adam with one of our cooperating gardeners. And we've surveyed these existing monarch butterfly gardens, way stations, that were planted by 22 citizen scientists. And some of these gardens were in urban settings, some were in para-urban settings, sort of to the outskirts of town, and some were out in the boondocks in rural settings like nature preserves and so on. Some of the gardens were structured. In other words, the plants were spaced apart and they were separated by mulch so that it was very easy to see the individual plants. Some of the gardens were non-structured, or sometimes we would refer to these as feral gardens, where everything was jumbled together into a big mass of plants like you see here. Some of the gardens were surrounded by hardscape, and believe it or not, the one in the upper left is a monarch butterfly way station in the middle of a highway or road median, and other gardens were in more open areas, like the one that's just getting started here on the lower right. Adam went out to these 22 gardens for 2 years, And he got on his hands and knees with some undergrad volunteers, and they counted all of the butterfly eggs and larvae in the gardens twice per month for 2 years to see if there were particular characteristics that were associated with more or less usage. We also characterized the way stations using GIS and sort of global imaging from the internet, looking at things like the amount of hardscape, the number of structures, proximity of structures, north-south access, and other variables that you see here. We used the GIS system to characterize hardscape and accessibility, particularly whether the plants were surrounded by buildings or the gardens were surrounded by buildings, or if there was clear access north, south, east, west, and so on. And we saw some important trends that were all statistically significant. We found that the structured gardens with the milkweed set off by mulch had 6-fold more monarchs in them than the ones that were all jumbled together. So already that recommendation on the Monarch Way Station website about planting your plants close together isn't necessarily correct if you want to attract a lot of monarchs. It really seemed to help to have a more structured garden with the plants set off by mulch. We found that gardens with unimpeded north-south access recruited many more monarchs than ones that didn't have north-south access. Now, some of the ones on the right would have probably been in courtyards and things like that. But, our hypothesis here is that the monarchs are primarily working their way north and south. And so all other things being equal, if you were planting a way station beside a library or school, it's probably better to put it on the east or west side of the building so the monarchs can get at it more easily. We looked at the different kinds of milkweed in these existing gardens. On the left is swamp milkweed, incarnata, and Syriac is the common milkweed. And then many of the gardens had butterfly weed, tuberosa, the one on the right. And we standardized it all by looking at monarchs per 100 stems or 100 ramets. And you can see that in these existing citizen-planted gardens, planted mainly by master gardeners, the swamp milkweed and the common milkweed were much more attractive to the monarchs than the butterfly weed. And these taller milkweed species tended to have a lot more monarchs on them than the shorter statured butterfly weed. More on that later. We were particularly interested in what the best configuration is for a small monarch butterfly garden. Again, they could be structured, they could be feral, they could be laid out in no particular pattern, or you could arrange them in some kind of an interesting layout like the one on the bottom that's shaped like a butterfly. Of course, we have no idea if monarchs would appreciate that or not. So we started with what's already known about how butterflies find their host plants upon which to lay their eggs. Remember, these monarch females are gliding over the landscape, moving mainly north and south, but back and forth, and they're looking down from the air for milkweed plants upon which to lay their eggs. And they're active by day. We know that butterflies, like most butterflies are active by day. They use primarily visual cues. They use their eyes. They home in on plant shape and leaf form to locate host plants for egg laying. This has not really been demonstrated strongly for monarchs, but it is known for other butterflies like swallowtails and longwing butterflies that they search visually. It's also known from studies with other butterflies that they tend to find isolated hosts more readily than host plants that are surrounded by non-host vegetation. In other words, it'd be easier for a butterfly to find a host plant standing by itself than one that's surrounded by high weeds, and that makes sense. So on the left, theoretically, an easy to find accessible plant. On the right, one that would be harder to find and lay eggs on. It's somewhat camouflaged by a non-host. Now, another thing we thought about was polyculture gardening, which I'm sure most of you know about, where we interplant plants or we mix up our gardens in polyculture. And the whole idea there is to make it harder for specialist insects like Mexican bean beetles and Colorado potato beetles and others to actually find and concentrate on their appropriate plants. We're trying to confuse the insects with polyculture gardening. Now, with Monarch butterfly gardens, our objective is exactly the opposite. We have a specialist herbivore, a monarch in this case, and we want it to be easy for that butterfly to find the appropriate host plants in a mixed garden. So we did a big experiment with about 15 replicated individual gardens, and we used the same set of plants, 2 nectar plants, Tithonia and Zinnia, and an ornamental grass, a non-host, an ornamental grass, and swamp milkweed. And the same number of plants, the same mix of plants, but the configuration was different. On the left, you see a garden where we planted the nectar plants in the interior of the garden and these ornamental grasses, and we put the milkweed around the perimeter, and we set it off with mulch, thinking that those plants would be very easy for incoming monarchs to find. The opposite was the inner diagram where the milkweeds were put in the inside of the garden, surrounded by the nectar plants and the ornamental grasses. And the third design was the feral design, if you will, all mixed up together. And Adam went out into these gardens for 2 years. We grew these and inspected them biweekly for monarch eggs and larvae and pupae. And he also got plenty of ticks and jitterbites in the process. And they were colonized very quickly by a lot of monarch caterpillars. Okay, and what we found in both years was that the gardens where we planted the milkweed on the perimeter had 2.5 to 4 times more monarch eggs and larvae than the other 2 designs of gardens, where presumably the milkweed would have been less apparent to the incoming milkweeds and harder for them to orient to and find. So the first take-home message from this experiment was that putting the milkweeds on the perimeter, setting them off with mulch, really seemed to matter. Garden design matters. Place the milkweeds around the perimeter set off by mulch. First take-home. We did other experiments like this one, where we took potted swamp milkweed and put it out in the middle of nowhere, out in a field, and we left it by itself. And then we had the same types of swamp milkweed plants, but we surrounded them by a screen of ornamental grasses. The grasses are not actually touching the milkweed plants, but they are forming a visual screen. And you can see that the numbers of eggs that are being laid in a few hours, very, very different, where the butterflies can see and orient to the shape, coloration, perhaps even the smell. We don't really know about that of the milkweed. They're much more likely to find it and colonize it. So the left is bound to be found, the right not so much. That's all consistent with what we saw in the gardens that we surveyed with the master gardeners, and also in our big experiment with the 3 different garden designs. We also were interested, of course, in which are the best milkweeds to use. We planted 6 gardens at the UK Arboretum to compare monarch usage of different milkweed species. You can see the garden going in there on the left, and then the milkweed plants have grown up on the right, and these gardens were scattered around in different places in the Arboretum. And we monitored these gardens for 2 years. Each of the gardens had 8 milkweed species, and you can see them here: common butterfly and swamp, probably our most familiar ones, but we also tried world and spider milkweed, less common ones, and 3 that were not indigenous to Kentucky: broadleaf, narrowleaf, and showy, which are not native to Kentucky, but we were interested just to see how they would perform. And we monitored again eggs and larvae for 2 years. We also reared the monarchs on these different types of milkweed plants. And the way one does this, if you're an entomologist, is you sew up a bunch of these bridal veil bags, a very fine, lightweight mesh, and you enclose the milkweeds in the field with the bags. And then you put tiny caterpillars in there, and you see how they do. And so we reared up the caterpillars to see their survival. We weighed them, and we saw if they were happy or not. And to make a long story short, and not show you a bunch of graphs and tables, the bottom line was that all of those milkweed species were very suitable for monarchs, and they all supported very similar larval growth. So from the standpoint of whether the milkweed is nutritious or not, they all were. But they didn't all recruit the same numbers of monarchs to feed on them. These relatively tall species, the swamp milkweed, the common milkweed, and the showy milkweed, attracted a lot more eggs, a lot more egg-laying monarchs than did the shorter species. The winners were swamp, common, and showy milkweed by far, 3-4 times as many caterpillars and eggs on them. And again, the two on the left are the ones that are native to North Carolina and to Kentucky, swamp and common. Now, milkweed's not just for monarchs, and it attracts a lot of other pollinators as well, various kinds of butterflies, lots of native bees and honeybees. And we'd like our pollinator garden to be useful for not just monarchs, but also some of the other pollinators, especially bees. So we also monitored the bees that came to these different milkweeds. We sampled and identified the types of bees visiting them. We actually identified several thousand bees that were collected from these gardens. I'm not going to, again, show you all the data and the complicated pie graphs. They were all identified to genus and many to species. You know, when you start sampling milkweed gardens like this over and over, the bees can get wise to you. So we had to come up with some clever ways of sneaking up on them. We did actually buy a bee mask. Didn't seem to work very well, but anyway, we did find that the best milkweeds for large bees, honeybees and bumblebees, were the common, the swamp, and the showy. And again, let's take the showy out of the picture because it's not native to this area, but the common and the swamp were the ones that the bumblebees and the honeybees really like. Has to do with the configuration of the flowers and the length of the bees' tongues. We found that the best milkweeds for variety of native bees were the butterfly weed and the world milkweed. So if you want to conserve bees as well, you want to include one or the other of these in your garden, and the butterfly weed is especially suitable for this purpose. And the monarchs do use butterfly weed, they just don't seem to find it and lay eggs on it to the same extent as the taller ones. We also looked at things like whether the milkweed was well behaved and stayed put in the garden, or whether it spread aggressively by rhizomes. And I think many gardeners have observed that common milkweed is a spreader, and swamp milkweed and butterfly milkweed are well behaved. But we actually quantified that by counting the number of escaped stems and tillers that went out into the turf grass around the gardens and so on. And we found that the common, narrow leaf, and showy milkweeds did spread aggressively by rhizomes. This is a picture from the internet of some common milkweed that's out in the middle of somebody's yard. And of course, it also grows quite tall and often falls over and shades the other plants in the garden. Not so well suited for a small garden. So our recommendation for North Carolina and Kentucky is the best milkweeds for small gardens are a mix of swamp and butterfly. The swamp particularly great for monarchs, and the butterfly milkweed particularly great for a wide variety of bees, both honeybees and native bees, but also good for monarchs. The best milkweed for filling in large open areas in the eastern US is common milkweed. And when I've worked with golf courses, helping them to decide what kinds of plants to put into their naturalized areas, or farmers for that matter, wanting to fill in the back 40, we always recommend common milkweed because it does self-seed and spread via its rhizomes and fill in areas from transplants or from a smaller number of plants. Now, monarchs need nectar plants as well. Again, this is their 5-hour energy, or more likely their sugary Gatorade that gives them the energy to fly around. And these are some of the great nectar plants for monarch gardens. The key is you want to have nectar plants that bloom throughout the monarch season from spring to fall. Now, you won't have time to write all of these ones down, so I'm going to direct you to the website of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. It's a really great organization, the Xerces Society, And they have on their website pages for different areas of the United States. And there's one for the Mid-Atlantic states that includes North Carolina. And there's a really nice list on their website of their recommended research-based nectar plants, ones that the monarch butterflies are really attracted to. And you can see they got it organized by spring, summer, and autumn. And so you can choose a selection from there, and you'll come out in a great shape in that regard. Okay, I know that because I'm talking to master gardeners, you're all familiar with the native plant movement, which has been publicized very strongly by Doug Tallamy, who I know and have known since he was a student. He wrote this very influential book, Bringing Nature Home, and there's just an enormous amount of interest in gardening with native plants. I don't want to get into the native plant controversy or the counter arguments or anything, but we were interested in one type of native plant, milkweeds, that's very important for the industry, the nativars or cultivars of native milkweed. Now, what is a nativar? It's a native plant genotype that was selectively propagated for desirable horticultural traits. That might be disease resistance or shape or leaf color. So here's an example of a nativar, eastern redbud. We all know that our native redbuds, a straight species, is a green leaf plant that grows in the forest understory. But if you go to the garden center or the nursery, you can buy selections of native redbuds that have a purple leaf, forest pansy redbuds, an example. Now, a horticulturist at some point in time in the past would have noticed that there was a natural variation, perhaps a mutation of the native genotype that gave this purple coloration, and then they propagated it by grafting or growing out the seeds. So that's a nativar, a cultivar of a native plant. Increasingly in the market, we don't see wild type milkweeds anymore, the ones you dig out of a natural area. Plant breeders, the horticulture industry knows that the industry thrives on variety. So they are selecting for and propagating milkweeds that have more vibrant coloration or slightly different colors. And these are very popular with consumers. You can see the sold out thing on the lower right. These are native milkweeds, but they have been selectively propagated for certain color characteristics primarily. So we did a study where we evaluated milkweed nativars in our research, and these are the nativars that we looked at. The ones on the top, the four at the top, are swamp milkweed cultivars, Soulmate, Ice Ballet, and Cinderella, compared to the wild type at the left. And the ones on the lower line, Hello Yellow, Gay Butterflies, and Blonde Bombshell, which was no doubt named by a guy, those are nativars or cultivars of the wild type butterfly milkweed. The gay butterflies actually produces multiple colors of flowers on the same plant. And the question was, are these any good for monarch butterfly conservation in small gardens, in small cultivated gardens? Are they as good as the straight species for supporting monarchs and bees? Now, I would not propose transplanting Ice Ballet, that white flowered swamp milkweed, out into a nature reserve or something like that. But these are the milkweeds that consumers are going to find in their garden center more often than not. We can see the straight species, the pink one on the left, the Ice Ballet on the right. We didn't know whether a monarch butterfly would even recognize that white milkweed as a host plant, again, since they search with their eyes. We planted replicated gardens with the nativars and the straight species. And again, we counted monarchs and bees for 2 years. And you can see some students that are here carefully examining those plants. The key finding from this study, and again, it's published if you'd like to read the details, was that the nativars, excuse me, recruited and supported as many monarchs as the wild type milkweeds. You can see a monarch there that's actually nectaring on that white Ice Ballet swamp milkweed nativar. Another key finding was that the milkweed nativars were, in all cases, and in some cases even more attractive than the wild-type milkweeds to bees. And that's not that surprising because these have been selected for having a very large flower, a more vibrant floral display, a bright yellow flower as opposed to an orange one. And so we didn't see any downside as far as the numbers of bees or the variety of bees that were attracted at all. So at least for small gardens, my suggestion is that don't thumb your nose at the nativars. They're going to be okay for supporting monarchs and for bees. Now, I'm getting toward the end here. This is my last research topic I want to talk about. Don't let your monarch garden become an ecological trap. And I think you can see what I mean by an ecological trap by this image. Urban conservation efforts can create ecological traps by attracting native species to habitat where the things we're trying to conserve incur very high mortality. I mean, the picture on the lower left, that's a terrible place to put a monarch butterfly garden because those butterflies are going to get creamed by vehicles when they try to fly there. And in fact, there are data now indicating that millions of monarchs are killed on highways and byways during their migration. So this is an example of an ecological trap, that garden. Things like cats can be ecological traps. Alien species can deliver the death blow in ecological traps. And we know that domesticated cats that run wild outdoors can incur tremendous mortality on songbirds that nest in suburban habitat that was intended to be there to help the birds. Okay, so getting back to alien species like cats and insects of conservation concern like monarchs and songbirds, the invasive species that we were concerned with in our studies is a wasp called the European paper wasp, Listes dominula, first reported in North America in the 1970s. And I guarantee if you go into your backyard or your neighbor's backyard, you're very, very likely to find this European paper wasp in nests under your garage eaves or in your shed or other types of habitats. It's an invasive wasp. It's now very, very widespread in the USA and elsewhere in the world. And it's only been with us for about 50 years. Now, how do you recognize this wasp? It looks a bit like a yellow jacket, but it has a thinner waist. You can see that the abdomen narrows at the front into kind of a wasp waist. And it has orange tipped antennae that are very, very obvious. If you see this wasp foraging in your vegetable garden and feeding on caterpillars, the orange antennae are an absolute tip-off. Yellow jackets don't have orange tipped antennae. European paper wasp is very strongly associated with urban settings. All of the research done on it in Europe and in North America indicates that it's not a wasp we find very often out in the woods. It tends to nest around human habitations and human structures, homes, garages, sheds, and so on. Often we see these umbrella-shaped nests that are underneath the eaves of a garage or a carport. But sometimes we see them in things like pipes, like you see the one on the right, where they've actually built their papery nest in there. This was a photo I took during the COVID lockdown. I was teaching remotely from home, but I went into my office to get something. And this is a dispenser for our Lexington newspaper. It hadn't been used for a while because nobody was going out to buy newspapers during the COVID lockdown. And you can see that the wasps had colonized the coin return slot of this dispenser right outside my building, and didn't want to get too close to that. Okay, paper wasps. This one and others prey mainly on caterpillars. They are carnivores. They swoop down, they find their victims, they bite them, often behind the neck. They chew them up into bite-sized pieces, fly off with them, and stuff them into their nests and feed them to their larvae. Now, if you find these wasps in your vegetable garden, you might consider them to be beneficial because they do feed on cabbage loopers and imported cabbage worms and army worms and other kinds of caterpillars as well. They are voracious feeders on caterpillars. including the invasive one, the European paper wasp. We surveyed gardens, 16 gardens in central Kentucky, and I'm willing to bet the same thing would be found in North Carolina. We spent an hour observing the wasps in each garden. The European paper wasp accounted for 3/4 of all of the predatory wasps we saw in these gardens. It has literally taken over and is outcompeting the native paper wasp species. It's a very common wasp. We spent hours observing wasp predation in urban gardens, including Monarch gardens. And this is Adam sitting on a chair all afternoon. I know I personally spent about 40 hours watching these gardens when he was in class and things like that. And we actually observed this European paper wasp to take as many as 60 monarch caterpillars from a garden in a single afternoon. European paper wasp preys on monarchs. We've seen them take dozens from gardens. Again, the record was 60 in a single day. You can see a European paper wasp with the orange antennae feeding on a small monarch there, where it would actually bite it, kill it, and carry it off whole. Or you can see there's one that's attacking a larger monarch caterpillar. Now, they feed in a very distinctive way. Again, monarch caterpillars are toxic to most insects. It'll literally gut the caterpillar. It'll slit it open, yank out the gut where most of the toxins are sequestered from the milkweed, and then fly off with the pelt and carcass after it's chopped it up. And it'll often leave the gut on the leaf as a telltale sign. It's pretty gruesome. We studied whether the caterpillars are vulnerable or not to these. And this was one of the very few graphs I'll show you, probably the only one left, or maybe one more, where the little caterpillars, the second instar caterpillars, are especially vulnerable. The blue is the ones that are killed upon their encounter with a wasp out of 30. The orange is the ones that are able to escape, either by dropping or thrashing about and acting in a very agitated way upon the wasp attack. As they get bigger to the 5th instar, they're often able to fight back and avoid the wasp predation. But the little ones and the medium-sized ones, as you can see, 3/4 or more typically are killed. Here's an example of 2 wasps ganging up on a big caterpillar, and they're tearing it to pieces, and they're going to chew it up and carry it off to their nest. We wanted to know, is this paper wasp a greater threat to monarchs in urban gardens as opposed to out in the boondocks? And that was an experiment that was pretty easy to do. We took 10 monarch caterpillars, small ones. We put them on swamp milkweed plants, and we exposed those plants for 8 hours in urban butterfly gardens or out in rural milkweed patches in some of our state parks and city parks. We had 10 sites of each type, and you can see the way this was done. And when we recovered these, we could often determine whether they had been attacked by these by the telltale gut and skin that was left behind. And the bottom line is that we saw that the wasp predation was nearly 9 times higher in urban gardens than in the rural settings. So it does bring to mind the idea that an urban garden where these wasps occur could be an ecological trap for our monarchs that would be a lot safer if they were growing up out in a rural habitat. More on that in a moment. Butterfly houses, not a good idea. If you go to the internet, you'll see advertisements for these crazy butterfly houses. I don't know what they're supposed to actually do. I've talked to lots of entomologists, and none of us has ever seen a butterfly overwintering or using a butterfly house, despite what it says down at the bottom. Butterfly house provides welcome respite for pollinators. But they are popular ornaments in gardens, including on our own campus. So we had a student group that went to all of our pollinator gardens and set these silly things up out there. And you can see there's a sign, pollinator habitat, no spraying. We inspected these all over campus. There were dozens of them. And in multiple gardens, we never found a single butterfly in one, but in almost every case, we found that they were colonized by European paper wasps. So this is a bit like putting a rattlesnake pit in the middle of a nursery school playground. Not a good idea. I surveyed during COVID a lot of the birdhouses and similar structures that are in our campus pollinator gardens, like the one you see on the left. And a very high percentage of those types of structures were indeed colonized by European paper wasps. They love these things. So my suggestion is keep these kinds of things out of your urban monarch butterfly gardens if you don't want to create an ecological trap. This may be a case where the wild ones and the master gardeners and other conservationists might need to hire Orkin to take care of the wasps, or else do it yourself. And you can buy these wasp and hornet killers at the big box stores. They shoot like 30 or 40 feet. And this is a job you can do by yourself, but I definitely recommend you do it at night, unlike this lady on the left. It's much better to sneak up at night, let them have it with this stuff, and then run back into the house. The wasp won't be as active, and they'll all be on the nest at night. And you can sometimes do the job yourself. Bottom line, though, is if you see these wasps around your garden, that's bad news for monarchs. Okay, last topic, tropical milkweed and no-grow. This is tropical milkweed. It's a beautiful plant. It's easy to grow. Monarchs love it. It's all over the internet. I don't know if you can buy it in the garden store in North Carolina, but it is not native to our region, and I don't believe it's native to North Carolina either. And it is a problem. The problem is that in temperate regions, it doesn't die back in the wintertime the way that our native milkweeds do. When the weather begins to turn cool, or toward the end of summer, our swamp milkweed, our common milkweed, after they produce the pods, the plant begins to slowly senesce and die back. And that's a signal to the monarchs that it's time to sort of pack it up and head for Mexico. Monarchs continue to use it well into the autumn, and they may fail to migrate in the fall. Now, tropical milkweed can also become a cesspool of infection by a pathogen that I can't pronounce. We can call it OE. The scientific name is at the top of the slide. The larvae ingest the spores of this pathogen on the plants, and then the infected adults will emerge stunted and unable to fly, or if they can fly, they're not strong enough to migrate or to mate. The caterpillars pick up this infection, this pathogen, on the host plants. Migration is a key for outrunning the disease and keeping the monarch population healthy. The disease tends to build up during the growing season. When native milkweeds die back in the autumn, the monarch pathogen dies off along with them. But when the tropical milkweed hangs around much longer, it becomes very attractive to the monarchs that are still in the area. They often land on it, continue to use it. The spores build up on those plants. And again, it becomes really a cesspool of this pathogen that can be very harmful to the monarchs that visit those plants, an ecological trap. There's another study, fairly recent, that shows that tropical milkweed has levels of cardenolides that the monarchs can cope with under cooler, normal climates. But as global warming is giving us hotter and hotter summers, or climate change giving us hotter summers, a lot of times it turns out with this particular milkweed, the cardenolide concentrations, the chemicals in the milkweed, become higher level to the point where they begin to make the monarch sick. So under warmer temperatures, tropical milkweed can become an unsuitable host for the monarchs. So don't use tropical milkweed in temperate zone gardens. It's an ecological trap. We recommend, and certainly the Xerces Society and other conservation groups in the know recommend, that in the temperate and the transitional areas of the US, like North Carolina, use the milkweed species native to your region. Tropical milkweed is okay if you're a first grade teacher and you're just raising a few larvae in the classroom. You're not a bad person. If you do plant it outdoors, be sure to cut it back in the autumn, but it's better not to use it at all outdoors. If Few take-home points. The end is in sight. Plant the milkweed around the perimeter or set it off by mulch. Don't hide it amongst other plants. Okay, make it bound to be found by incoming monarchs that are searching primarily by sight cues, size and shape of the leaves and plants. Plant the gardens where there's north-south access to incoming butterflies, all other things being equal. We don't fully understand why the data showed that, but certainly if we surround the garden by a bunch of buildings, it's not going to be easy for the monarchs that are flying across the landscape to find the garden. Open places are better. The best milkweeds we recommend for small gardens in the eastern US are a combination of the swamp and the butterfly. The swamp is especially attractive to the monarch butterflies and suitable for their caterpillars. The butterfly milkweed is a little less apparent to the incoming monarchs, but it's good food for the monarchs that end up on it, and it also is very attractive to a wide range of native bees. If you're filling in an open area like a garden, a nature preserve, or establishing milkweed on a golf course or the back 40 of your gentleman's farm, then we recommend common milkweed, which will spread and tiller and fill in those areas. Planting milkweed, including nativars, supports monarchs and bees in gardens. We know for sure that if you plant the gardens, they will come. Okay, in most of our experiments, within a week or two of putting small milkweed transplants out in the field, we had monarch butterfly caterpillars on the milkweed, and lots of bees too, as soon as it bloomed. So it does work for sure. Don't let your garden be an ecological trap. We don't want to plant tropical milkweed in the temperate zone, and you want to avoid or manage the invasive European paper wasp. I have to admit that based upon our paper wasp experiments, I have wondered whether or not it would be better to put the milkweed out in the boondocks as opposed to next to my garage or something like that. The value of urban gardens as a teaching tool to teach our children and so on is indisputable for raising awareness. But I'm very concerned that this paper wasp can be a game changer. Teach your children well. Those are two of my granddaughters, Halloween some years ago. One is a monarch and one is a bumblebee. They've grown up some, but they're still cute. But do teach your children well, because the monarch is a wonderful teaching tool for raising future citizens who care about the environment and conservation. If you'd like more reliable information, I would recommend these three organizations: the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, the Monarch Joint Venture website, and monarchwatch.org. These all three have a wealth of information about gardening, about monarch life histories, and all sorts of other things monarch-wise. These are great groups worthy of your support. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it. Last thing I'll say is that I heard from Chip Taylor, who's the founder of the Monarch Way Station program, via an email this week. There's going to be a section on monarch butterfly conservation on 60 Minutes this Sunday. I haven't actually checked my TV schedule yet to see, but I'm pretty sure that one of the three segments on 60 Minutes is going to be going to the monarch butterfly sanctuaries in Mexico and also talking about the plight of the monarchs. So check it out. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm sure that I've gone a little over, but if there are questions, this is the most important thing I'm doing today, and I'll stick with you as long as it takes to answer all the questions.
All right, that was excellent. There's been lots of comments in the chat about how wonderful your presentation was, and we do have some questions.
Great.
So I'll scroll through chat, and some of them were addressed as you went along. Questions would come up, and then your next slide would talk about it. But so there were a couple of questions at the very beginning when you were talking about the migration as to why do the monarchs migrate so far? Like, why to Canada and then why back down to Mexico? Is it just seeking friendly climates at different seasons?
Well, I sure wish I knew the answer to that question, and I'm not sure that anybody knows the answer to that question. It's a amazing natural phenomenon. And why do the monarchs not just stop in Texas, or why don't they behave like all of our other butterflies and moths and just spin a cocoon and wait out the winter? I don't know, and I don't know if anybody can answer that question. Um, I will say that I just recently finished a very interesting book by an author that I bet many of you have read, Barbara Kingsolver. And Barbara Kingsolver wrote a book called, I think it's called Flight Behavior. And in that book, she it's a fictional book about a woman who lives in the mountains of North Carolina, who goes up in the holler and up into the mountains and finds that the forest is full of monarchs. And the monarchs have decided to stop in the highland mountains of North Carolina to spend the winter. And there's one group that wants to log the mountainside, and there's one group that doesn't. And it's a very interesting fictional account that has a climate change theme to it. But if you're a Barbara Kingsolver fan, I recommend the book. I enjoyed it very much. But she's exploring the question of why don't they stop in North Carolina? Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, obviously the monarch butterfly migration evolved a very, very, very long time ago. And every animal has its own life history. Why does a panda eat what it eats? I don't know.
Yeah, some of those great mysteries that
Yeah,
keep life
yeah,
interesting, right?
yeah.
The next question is related to the milkweed plants themselves, about the toxins. Are they stored in special organs or is it in organelles of all their cells?
That's one that I think I can answer. And first, full disclosure, this project that I talked about with Adam Baker is the first graduate project that I ever advised on monarchs. So I am not a national monarch expert like Karen Oberhauser is or some of the others, but our work again was some of the first to address small gardens. I did teach a graduate course on insect-plant relationships that included plant defenses. So I know a bit about this question. Milkweed, of course, has veins, as do all plants, but milkweed also has a second set of vein-like structures called canals, latex canals. And the canals basically follow the veins and stems. They're not the organs that have the phloem sap, but the canals contain we call it a canalicular defense, which in this case is latex sap, similar to what you see in poinsettia when you break the leaf. And that latex sap is full of the toxic chemicals and it's pressurized. So as you know, if you break a milkweed leaf or prick it with a pin, it immediately oozes out, like out of a pressurized toothpaste tube, if you will. Um, the plant itself manufactures the cardenolides and then they're stored in these canals.
All right. That is fascinating. Let's see, questions we have. The next one is about the butterflies themselves. Do they need a protein source such as pollen?
No, not to my knowledge. The butterflies, of course, the caterpillars are the growth stage, but the butterflies are nectar feeders, and I don't think their mouth parts would be in any way suited for feeding on pollen. They have that sort of coiled soda straw proboscis that is everted and then stuck down into the flower to sip the nectar. They're liquid feeders.
All right, so they get all they need from the flowers, from the
Yeah.
nectar. So the next question, when you were talking about the design of the garden and you showed having the milkweeds on the outside, so they were clearly visible to the butterflies, was best. But this question kind of makes that a little bit broader. It says, is it best to plant milkweed on outer boundaries of your property in order to draw more monarch butterflies in?
Well, I haven't done that research, so I'm only going to guess at it. There is a small amount of research out of Australia. By the way, there are monarchs in Australia that are introduced there. So even if we lose the eastern population,
Mhm.
the species won't go extinct. That's good. But there is some evidence that it's probably better to plant 100 patches of 10 milkweeds than one patch of 1,000. They
Oh, wow.
tend to use edges. Um, with big milkweed patches, the research indicates that you'll find more milkweed, more larvae, more eggs and larvae around the edges of the patch than in the interior. So I'm guessing that, obviously every property is different, but I can't really say, but I would not hide it in the woods. Um,
So have it
I
out
think
there
the
where it's easy to
research
find.
definitely suggests that having a greater number of smaller patches is going to have more conservation value than a single giant patch.
That's great. And our home gardens provide that opportunity.
They do, yeah. I mean, I love the home garden concept until the paper wasps.
Yeah.
And then I I have to admit that I don't know that anybody knows this, but um, the paper wasps are a big deal. And whether or not a home garden is a net benefit, or whether the milkweeds that are flying across the landscape would be better off just bypassing your yard and heading for the next state park away from your garages and bird boxes is not known. It's not known.
And how far do those paper wasps forage? Like in a
Yeah,
typical quarter-acre yard,
uh,
if you have paper wasp nests up under your porch, are they going to be foraging that whole yard? Do you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Yeah.
I've gotten that question before, and again, I don't
Mm,
know that anybody knows the answer to that. But paper wasp and yellow jackets. I mean, we do know something about how far yellow jackets forage, and there's no question that if your neighbor has a wooden garage and there's European paper wasps nesting around it, that those wasps are going to find their way to your backyard if you've got a half-acre lot.
mhm.
If your neighbor's a half a mile away, maybe not. But I'm guessing that these wasps will forage over a few hundred meters. And they actually seem to be able to follow one another, which is also disturbing. Once a wasp finds a nice patch of caterpillars, whether it's your vegetable garden where they would maybe be beneficial in picking off the caterpillars on your cabbage, or finds your monarch garden, they will return back and forth. They use landmarks, they will return. And we've actually, I'm not a wasp and I can't think like one, but we certainly get the impression that they watch one another. That if they see wasps that are hovering around where there's some caterpillars, another one's going to come there. We've actually seen them fighting over the same caterpillar.
Wow. Yeah, those were some pretty gruesome pictures you shared.
Have
Um,
lots more than that. Yeah.
the next question goes back to the planting and how you were talking about the taller milkweed species were the butterflies found them better. So if you surround milkweed with short plants, say, you've got a swamp milkweed and it's 3 feet tall,
Yeah.
is it okay? Is it going to detract the butterflies, or will you have less butterflies visiting it if you've got it surrounded by much smaller plants, say things that are just a foot tall?
Well, we haven't done that experiment. The study I showed you is with the 3 garden designs is the one that we did. But my guess is it would be okay.
Okay.
As long as the butterflies can clearly see and orient to the plants, just like us, if you're going to pick blackberries or something like that, you don't want to have to wade your way through a bunch of brambles to get at the blackberries. And I think as long as the milkweeds would stand out and be visible, and again, the butterfly's up in the air, it's not
Mm,
crawling on the ground. I think that would be fine. That's my my guess. Yeah, I don't think there's a problem there.
Yeah,
What we
there's some
don't want to do
discussion.
is, just let the whole garden become overgrown and have a tiny, butterfly milkweed surrounded by weeds and brush and other things, because the monarch is not going to find it in that situation.
Yeah. There was some discussion about the aphids, the orange aphids that get on milkweed. Um, would you recommend trying to control those, and if so, how would you do that?
That's another very common question. And actually, one of my former students, Bernie Mock, is down in Florida studying ways to control the aphids without hurting the monarchs, which is a challenge. She's got some data indicating that the monarchs don't like to lay their eggs on leaves that are covered with honeydew and
Mm,
sooty mold. Okay, so if the aphids are really out of hand, her study suggests that those plants become a little less attractive. So that's one thing. Um, how do you control aphids and not hurt monarch caterpillars? Um, a little water, a Q-tip with alcohol on it, trying to stay on them. It's a challenge, and you can't always get what you want. Um, most of the chemicals that control aphids are going to hurt monarchs. So certainly we don't want to use neonicotinoid insecticides
mhm,
or anything like that. A little careful use of insecticidal soap, like a safer soap, maybe from a 1 quart hand spray bottle, and just being careful. I mean, you can spot monarch caterpillars, right? The soap doesn't have any residual toxicity. Okay, it's not in self, inherently toxic, but if you hit baby caterpillars with it, you'll kill them.
mhm.
So using the soap in a very selective, careful way would probably be the way to go, or even a stream of water sometimes is enough to knock off the aphids. And I've certainly
Huh.
seen aphids and monarchs coexisting on the same plant. They just
Mhm.
seem to be a little less attractive unless it gets really out of hand and that plant is all sticky and covered with sooty mold.
And would that honeydew attract wasps?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's another another
That
problem.
study also has not been done, to my knowledge, with regard to European paper wasp and milkweed. But when I've done a lot of work with scale insects, and of course, much of it has been done at NC State by Steve Frank and his group, who's great, by the way. Steve Frank is a jewel that you
Mm,
have in your NC State system. And there's no question that paper wasps are attracted to the honeydew of soft scale insects. I have photographs of those paper wasps on the honeydew. So yeah.
yeah,
Um, yeah, you can't always get what you want.
yeah. And back to the insecticidal soap, you could see the caterpillars and avoid those. But
Yeah,
would insecticidal soap hurt the eggs because they're quite tiny?
well, at least in my experience, the aphids tend to be primarily on the stems and on the very
Mm,
youngest foliage, the
that's a good
very young
point.
shoots that probably don't have monarch eggs on them yet. I
Mm,
mean, I'm guessing you could even pinch off a lot of the aphids when you see them getting going. Um, yeah, I've never seen any studies where anyone has sprayed monarch butterfly eggs with insecticidal soap and see if they do or don't hatch. I doubt those studies exist. I would think it wouldn't do the eggs any good.
yeah, yeah. Um, So there was a general question about if you were going to plant a monarch garden, is there a better time of year? From a gardening standpoint, there's different reasons, different times of years are good, but from the monarch standpoint, is there a better time of year to start a garden for monarchs?
Yeah, I think there certainly is. And again, I'm not a gardener. I'm sure everyone in the audience is a better gardener than I am. Um, we tried to establish milkweed plots on golf courses by tilling and using herbicides to kill off the existing weeds and things, and then seeding. We had very poor success with seeding. We've always had much better success with transplants, whether it was on golf courses or in gardens. Here in Kentucky, when we did our research, we waited until the certified frost-free date, which was, I think, May 6th or something like that. Historically, it's probably much earlier than that now, with the way our climate is. But we lucked out, and we put as I recall, in those original garden studies, we planted May 6th, and we had monarch eggs on those plants a week later. Even though they were just
Wow.
transplants, they found them that quickly. So I would say as soon as the frost-free date is over in North Carolina, go for it. The
Yeah.
monarchs are already arriving from Texas. The grandchildren of the ones that overwintered in Mexico are probably already reaching North Carolina by early May.
Yeah. I would even say if you could get the plants in late summer and plant them in early fall, larger plants, to
Yeah,
get them established before winter, then they'll be a little bigger and huskier when they come up the next
yeah,
spring to
that's a
sustain
great
that.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, I didn't do that experiment. We worked with transplants in the spring, but you're absolutely right, because in the second year of the studies, in both cases where we did the native study and the other one, the plants that came up in the second year were more robust and bigger and
Mhm.
got going sooner. So sure, yeah.
Yeah. There was some discussion around the migrations and the number of generations. So in the northern migration, there's multiple generations.
Yes.
But when that southern migration, is that just one generation flying back, or do multiple generations occur in the southern
My
migration?
understanding is it's a single generation flying
Okay.
back, which is
Wow.
amazing. I think they've actually tracked individual butterflies from Canada arriving in Mexico. They
Wow.
can tag them and see that. They will ride thermals and things. They get up high in the sky, and they can float along with the winds and things like that, which is absolutely extraordinary. Um, if you go to the websites of any of the three organizations I mentioned, there's another one called Journey North that maybe you're familiar with, the Journey North, and they have quite a lot of discussion about the monarch migration. But my understanding, everything I've read that I recall, is that they're flying back in one fell swoop rather than stopping along the way. Now, that's not to say that every monarch is in Canada. As you know, we have monarchs in Kentucky and North Carolina in the late summer. So some of them hang around. But their journey is a little shorter. But I think the monarchs that you see in September in North Carolina are on their way to Mexico.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes they're kind of tattered looking too. You wonder if they're
Yeah,
actually going to
yeah,
make it.
yeah.
So there was a question we talked about where the toxin is in the plants, but where is the toxin stored in the butterflies themselves?
The data indicate it's all over.
Mhm.
They sequester it from the caterpillar, and then it's in the chrysalis. Okay, it's retained from the diet of the caterpillar, and then it's in the veins of of course the body of the monarch, but also in the wings, in the veins. And so a bird might peck at the orange wings and get a taste. I don't know, and I'm not sure I've seen the data or if anybody even has it, like what percentage of monarchs that are attacked by a bird, and the bird gets, just a small taste, and then the monarch, it drops it and it flies away. I
Mhm.
don't know that I've ever seen that data, but I know that if a bird kills a monarch and eats it, it learns its lesson. But it's certainly in the vena. It's translocated in the veins, which protects the wings and the body too. And
Mhm.
then into the eggs. The female butterfly imbibes the eggs with some cardenolide as well, which serves to partially protect them. Although there's one fairly recent study that indicates that there are quite a lot of things that feed on milkweed, monarch eggs nonetheless. The reality is that, for every 100 eggs that are laid, it's a very small percentage that actually make it. And there are a variety of creatures that will bite the eggs and prevent them from hatching or even consume the eggs.
Wow. It's a tough life.
It is, it's a tough life.
Yeah.
The butterflies, they don't lay thousands of eggs, but they seem to lay enough eggs that enough survive to keep the population, replacing itself. But it's normal for there to be, greater than 75% mortality from predators and things in the course of a generation.
Wow. Mentioning those predators, the European wasp, there was a question about whether there were parasitoids or parasitic wasps that would attack the European paper wasp. So what's out there helping to keep the European paper wasp population under control?
Evidently not very much, because it's a wasp that seems to be increasing and actually outcompeting native wasps. I don't know of any natural enemies, certainly not ones that we can manipulate to suppress that. I have a colleague, his name is Whitney Cranshaw. He wrote that wonderful picture book on insect pests of gardens that some of you might own, Whitney Cranshaw. And he called me from Colorado when we published our study, and he said that they were seeing these paper wasps in Colorado. And he said ever since they arrived, they can hardly find any monarch caterpillars at all. I don't know that the rest of the monarch science community is willing to say that the paper wasps are the biggest mortality factor, compared to the loss of habitat or the overwintering mortality in the Mexican highlands. But my opinion is that the paper wasps are the biggest mortality factor in urban settings.
Wow. And they were just mainly on the caterpillars. Were they attacking the chrysalis at all, or just that caterpillar stage?
We don't know. We didn't do that
Okay.
study. So I can't answer that question, but I'll tell you another interesting study that my student Adam Baker is doing right now. Becky just sent me some of the results last week. During COVID, we started playing with clay caterpillars. We bought yellow, white, and black clay, and we made like first graders, and we rolled like Play-Doh cylinders of different colors, and we built our little clay caterpillars, and we were going to put them out on milkweed plants and look at the extent to which they were pecked at by birds. And Adam just finished that study now that the pandemic is over, and he's submitted it for publication. But he did send me some pictures, and an awful lot of those clay caterpillars were pecked. So a bird, I mean, there's lots of naive birds out there in the world, right, that haven't ever tasted a monarch caterpillar. And so I'm guessing that the initial encounter between a bird and a monarch caterpillar is almost always lethal for the monarch, right?
Right.
And I think the same is probably true with the paper wasps. He did observe paper wasps, and I've observed paper wasps biting these clay caterpillar models. So anyway, it's tough to be a monarch caterpillar out there in spite of your chemical defenses.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. No, that was a long answer to the direct question of I'm not aware of anything that we could release in our landscapes, whether it was spiders or lacewings or ladybird beetles, that would take care of these paper wasps. They are social wasps. They're pretty aggressive. I should say that, if you don't know what you're doing, don't go after European paper wasps any more than you would go after yellow jackets. Those wasp spray products can work well, but it would be better to either hire somebody if you don't have running shoes, or to certainly do it at night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so with the chrysalis themselves, are there predators or parasites that affect that chrysalis stage? Because I've seen that before where the
Yeah.
chrysalis will like go black and
Yeah.
ooze or yeah, something's happened to it.
There are viruses there. I think that OE can actually sometimes kill the chrysalis and make it oozy and black. There are predators that attack the chrysalis. Um, I don't have the list in my head, but they do sustain some mortality as well. It's
Mm,
interesting how the caterpillars often wander off of the plant that they're feeding on to make their chrysalis somewhere else as well. So, but we didn't work much with the chrysalis stage in our studies.
yeah. Yeah, I've seen that behavior. We once had a patch of milkweed and we had a picnic table beside the patch. And we kept finding all these chrysalis under the milkweed, under the picnic table. They would crawl away from the milkweed patch and get under the picnic table and make their chrysalis.
If you'll allow me to brag for just 1 second, but there's a reason for my bragging. The paper that we published on the milkweed garden configurations has been viewed 40,000 times or so now. It's in the top 2% of views of any paper ever published in that journal, which I think speaks to the interest of
Mhm.
people in the monarch butterfly and small gardens. The paper wasp paper is in the top 5% of all papers published in scientific reports, which also speaks to the fact that there's a lot of people that are very interested in invasive species and conservation and the interaction between the two. And it's a classic case of an invasive species impacting an organism of conservation concern. Um, the other one being domestic cats and songbirds. So the fact that those papers have been so very widely read, maybe it's because they're great papers, but I think it also speaks to the fact that there's a ton of people out there that care about monarch butterflies.
Yeah. And I've had several people ask about the things you've mentioned, and I just want to let everybody know that I've been capturing some of the references that you've mentioned and the papers. So I'll have links to those that I'll send out with the recording. So
Yeah,
all of the resources that have been mentioned will be included in our follow-up
I have all
resource
the papers
document.
on my desktop of my computer.
Oh,
And
great.
if I get an email from somebody that would like to read the papers, it's easy for me to just to click attach and put them right on the email and send it back for those that would like to read the original research.
Okay, excellent. Few more questions. So there's a question about buying rearing kits, where you can buy when you buy those kits, I think you're buying the caterpillars, or I don't know if they're still in the egg stage, but when is
Mhm.
a good time to buy a rearing kit so the larva has time to grow, form its chrysalis, and then be released? I know these are used in
That's
schools a
a
lot.
really good question about rearing monarchs indoors. I don't know the best time to buy a rearing kit. I think that if one released the butterflies anytime during the growing season, they would have a fighting chance, if you will. But the Xerces Society has on their website suggested that people should not try to mass rear monarchs for conservation purposes. Again, if you're a first grade teacher or you have grandkids like I do, and you just want to have a fun activity to teach the kids about conservation or nature, you're not a bad person for raising a few monarchs, even on tropical milkweed. You're a good person for trying to teach. But as far as whether bringing in eggs and larvae and then rearing them indoors and releasing them, the data suggests that monarchs that are reared in captivity are often not competitive. The males are lousy maters. They're weak flyers. They're disoriented. And Xerces Society suggests leave them alone outdoors. And if they get eaten by predators, so be it. they may have written that before the paper wasp study came out just a few years ago. If I was concerned about the monarchs in my garden, I would probably put an organy mesh or bridal veil mesh bag over the plant
Mhm.
and leave it there until the monarchs were almost full size and then remove the bag. I think you'd be more likely to allow them to do their thing and emerge naturally and be competitive and vigorous than if you were to, pluck them off and rear them on leaves in your bedroom.
Hmm. Yeah, so like a physical barrier around
Anyway,
your
you can look
plant.
on the Xerces Society website about rearing monarchs indoors, and they say they don't recommend it
Mhm.
for conservation purposes. You're not helping the population by doing that.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. We got just a few more. Question about the adult monarch butterflies. Do they die after laying their eggs?
That's another good question. And again, I'm not a monarch guru to the extent that some of those that have spent their whole careers, but they don't live more than a few weeks. Yes, the females, I mean, males will mate, as males often do. They'll mate with as many females as they can, as far as the insect world. The males actually will set up territories. You've probably seen dragonflies on the edges of ponds where the dragonflies are flying back and forth, or cicada killers that will fly at you in your garden. Those are the male cicada killers that have set up a territory. And male monarch butterflies will actually set up a territory on the edge of a patch of milkweeds. And if another male comes into their neighborhood, if you will, they'll actually fly at that male and try to drive it away. Um, I don't think the butterflies individually live for more than a few weeks. Um, they're certainly not living the entire growing season, but I couldn't tell you exactly how many days a monarch lives.
All right. I think there was a question about one more question. The last one, I think that's a new question. Is will yellow jacket traps? I'm not sure what's being referred to as a yellow jacket trap work for the European paper wasp. So I don't know if you're familiar with a yellow jacket trap. I'm not.
Yeah, I know what they are for sure.
Okay.
And that's a really great question, and I don't know the answer to it. It would be a very good undergraduate research project or a great one for Charlotte Glenn or another county agent to send out to citizen scientists and ask them to empty their yellow jacket traps and see if they have any wasp with orange tipped antennae. The answer is I don't know. Um, I'm pretty sure that these wasps, I'm positive that they forage visually looking for caterpillars, but I'm also pretty sure they forage looking for tattered leaves and probably the volatiles that are released by chewed leaves. But I
Hmm.
don't know if they come to yellow jacket traps. That's an easily answered question. And all you need is
Well,
100 citizen scientists who have yellow jacket traps to dump them out and send them a picture. And I sure would like
yeah.
to know if you find out.
What? So explain to me what a yellow jacket trap is, because I don't know what that is.
Well, I don't remember exactly what it's baited with, to tell you the truth. Not being a yellow jacket biologist, I'm sure there's somebody in the audience that knows better than I do. Or you can grab your cell phone and look up how does a yellow jacket trap work, which
Okay.
I'm tempted
Yeah.
to do right now to give you a credible answer.
I do see there's several apparently commercially available. I just did a
Oh
quick
yeah,
search
yeah,
for
I
yellow
know it has
jacket trap.
it has volatiles in
Okay.
it.
Okay.
Maybe alcohols of one type or another. Or
Well, this,
there's one that has
yeah,
fermenting fruit juices too.
I've made a little note of this. This could be a good citizen science project for our
Yeah, and
master
now
gardener
you've got me
volunteers.
wanting, I can't wait to get off of here so I can look it up. But I think some of them use odors that are similar to fermenting fruit juice as well. But full disclosure, I honestly don't know what the lure is in yellow jacket traps.
Okay. Well, I think we have Sharon comments that she uses wine in her yellow jacket trap,
Yeah,
which
yeah, I
is
think
like
we can do.
fermenting fruit. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I think we have covered all the questions. And just to let folks know, I did put a link in the chat to where the recording and the resource document is going to be posted. That's on the North Carolina EMG intranet on the continuing education page. So it may be a day or two before I get all that done, but it'll be there by the end of the week, I'd say. Um, we really appreciate you joining us, Dr. Potter, and we appreciate all of the amazing information you've shared with us, and it has been truly inspiring. And I can imagine we'll have lots of great demonstration garden projects and various education programs that our Master Gardener volunteers, are able to take to the next level because of your presentation today. So
Well,
thank
I
you for
really
joining us.
appreciate your inviting me. This was the highlight of my week, and it gave me a chance to exercise my teaching itch a little bit that I don't have now that I'm retired. But I really do appreciate everyone who's attended. And again, I'm not a lifelong Monarch scientist by any means, but I did work with a very bright graduate student, and I think we tried to identify some questions that folks like yourself would want to know about small gardens. And most of the research on monarch butterflies is not focused on small gardens.
Right, right. Very little research in general is focused on small
Yeah.
gardens, which is what has made this so
Yeah.
especially relevant today. All right. Well, again, you can see all of the compliments coming in the chat, and we thank you so much for being with us today.
Okay. Well, thank you again. And you have a wonderful entomology department at NC State with, I know many of the people there. And if you haven't made an acquaintance with NC State entomology, that's a resource that's not available in very many states. And from what I've seen of your cooperative extension service, it's extraordinary too. So yeah,
Well,
hats
thank
off.
you. Yeah, we do work with the entomology department quite a lot. I don't know if you know Matt Bertone. He's the director of our
I
plant
do.
disease and insect clinic.
Yes.
Yes, so Matt Bertone, myself, and then Mike Munster, who's one of our plant
Yes.
pathologists, host a webinar each month during the growing season. So we did that
Steve.
yesterday. So,
Steve Frank is a brilliant entomologist in urban
yes,
landscapes. Kobe Schall is a brilliant entomologist for bed bugs and termites at NC State. And our youngest faculty member is out of NC State, Caleb Wilson, who got my old job. So we have lots of connections with NC State.
yes, we are fortunate to have excellent faculty here, excellent volunteers, and excellent extension professionals. So.
Okay, well, I'd love to hear from anybody who's still around. If you make any observations of your own, I can't wait to find out whether yellow jacket trap attract the wasps or anything else that folks are able to add to the story. I'm still learning too, and again, appreciate very much your attendance and the invitation.